Okay, so after this first roundtable on what the regulation of other sectors could tell us on how to best regulate digital platforms, we wanted to open the roundtable focused on platforms by one on virality. Why virality? Because it's so specific to digital platforms and so much at the core of the trouble they can cause. So hence the question raised by this roundtable: could a regulation of virality accommodate freedom of expression and availability of accurate and reliable information in the public sphere? And more specifically, we asked our speakers to address 4 key questions. So what's the matter with virality on platforms, and why is it such an issue? That's the first question, of course, to start with. And then what, since we want to focus to have this symposium focus on propositions, what are the key measures to take to regulate it in a way that could balance freedom of speech and information as a public good? And if possible, at both local or national and international levels. Third, what can be expected at this stage from UNESCO guidelines on this topic? And last, what would you recommend to help UNESCO guidelines to be more relevant? How to push them a bit further? How could we make sure its implementation will have real impact? So to answer these questions, I am particularly honored to welcome today 5 leading experts on the field, coming from very different backgrounds. So we have first Matthias Kettermann, professor of innovation law at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. He notably, among many other projects, heads the research project platform/democracy Humboldt University Institute for Internet and Society. Then we will have Sachin Dhawan, who will join us from Delhi, who is a program manager at the Center for Communication Governance at National Law University in Delhi. And his work focuses on intermediary liability, free speech, and privacy-related issues. Then we will have Helena Schwartheim, a senior digital policy research manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in Germany, where she leads the Digital Policy Lab, working on policy responses to prevent and counter disinformation, hate speech, extremism. Elena, among others, also leads a team of analysts studying digital threats posed to democracy by disinformation, hate speech, and extremism. Then we have Shashak Mohan, who is a colleague of Sachin Dhawan. He's also a program manager at the Technology and Society team at CCG. He studies the effect of digitization and the internet on human rights, specifically the rights to privacy and free speech. And last, we have Ellen Judson, who is the head of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media, which is the digital research hub at the UK think tank Demos, where she specializes in information environments online. Elena, Sachin, Ellen, and Shashank will join us remotely. And just like the first roundtable, this one will again unfold in 3 phases. First, each speaker will have 10 minutes to expose their views. Then we'll let them react to each other. And finally, we'll open the Q&A session with the audience, both here in this room and remotely. And please do share your questions. And let me say hello to our guest, Guillermo, who made this whole conference possible here at UNESCO. He's the main organizer of the conference. Hello, and thank you, Guillermo, for having us. Thank you. Okay, so the floor is yours, Matthias. You just jumped out of your train coming from Austria to explain us how to deal with virality and get rid of it.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really not quite sure that we want to completely get rid of morality after all, you know?
Yeah, that was a provocation.
I know, that's great. I love provocation. I've got 2 children. They're big fans of that. Now, thanks for having me. I won't take all 10 minutes, but I'll just give you a short introduction to some aspects which I find are particularly interesting when it comes to regulating online speech dynamics. Now, we know that that one of the key characteristics of online speech is the potential to go viral. Now, going viral sounds like it's a natural process, but of course it is anything but a natural process. Yes, there are some unpredictable factors at work when a certain piece of news gets broadcast widely, but we do have to keep in mind that this all happens within private orders where platforms, usually platforms, set certain rules and have developed over the years, have refined over the years algorithms that influence how communication takes place in those spaces. The first key point I'd like to make is that nothing is nothing is independent of choices made by those that own those communication spaces. Algorithms, especially recommender algorithms, work in different ways. There are algorithms that are predicated on your past interactions with content. Have you liked pictures of dogs in the past? And there will be a more than average chance that you'll see more dog-related content. There are also algorithms that abstract from experiences of people with similar characteristics like you have. So when you're from a specific country or when you've expressed interest in certain subjects in the past, similarity algorithms will try to test out whether you're perhaps also interested in content that's similar to one that you've interacted with in the past. And in addition, you usually have ad algorithms at play, which will try to make ads most relevant to you, relevant in the sense of how much time will you spend on looking at them. So you have a situation where you have different kinds of algorithms at play in a communication space where the rules of a private actor reign supreme, have reigned supreme for a very long time. So whenever we want to address how to negotiate and govern virality and the spread of information and disinformation, we have to ask ourselves, so where are the limits of what those private actors can and should do alone? And how can we include a public dimension, public interest into those processes? So the second message I'd like to make after the first one, which was, if you recall, that this happens in private spaces ruled by private algorithms, but they're all contingent upon decisions by those private actors. The second message is, how do we make that better? How can we change that? How can we include a public interest option, a public interest dimension into the way that those platforms apply rules, develop algorithms, optimize algorithms? And you have two choices here, basically. The first is regulation, and the second is a democratic recoupling of private and public interest. When it comes to regulation, we don't have to look any further than the experiences that we'll have from 2024 onwards with the new EU digital rules, including rules on digital services, digital markets, data and data governance. Those rules are trying to curtail some of the negative externalities of private ordering, some of the negative effects of private communication orders and the way that their algorithms have been oriented towards not public good, but value extraction for private gain, with a concurrent socialization of the consequences, right? Because that's the problem, private gains are okay, but if you then socialize the costs, the social costs, if you externalize the social costs, that's when it gets problematic for societies, which will then suffer from these externalities. All right. So what are the things that the European rules on digital services, digital markets are doing regarding the spread of virality? Well, they're not they're not regulating information per se, right? You will not find any rules on what kind of information is allowed and what kind of information is prohibited. That's okay. That's important for liberal societies, not to get involved too much into the kind of, to the content itself. What those rules are saying is that platforms need to inform regulators, the digital service coordinators, the European Commission, depending on their size, about their algorithm, about the recommender algorithms they use, about the goals on which those algorithms are optimized for, right? So virality will become more predictable in certain categories. That's the way to go through a regulation. And the other way, which I believe is also important, and perhaps we can discuss a bit about that, is to try to make the rules that impact what goes viral better. And you can do that by including people who are touched by the, who are impacted by the way that information travels on them. For example, through the creation of platform parliaments, through the creation of platform councils. Some platforms have experimented with that. The most well-known is the Meta Oversight Board, which is quite, of course, a platform parliament, but it's the first approach towards including external interests in the way that platform rules are being developed and platform and then algorithmic moderation practices are negotiated. So we see here an example of how, let's call them public values, or at least public-oriented values, can be included into the speech regime of a private So to reiterate those 2 points, regulation is one way to go, transparency regulation, transparency rules, algorithmic explainability, and the other approach would be to ensure that the rules itself, sort of in an ex ante, the first option is sort of the ex post option, and the ex ante option would be to make sure that the rules themselves are better, the algorithms themselves are better, that virality itself is not the goal, but rather the spread of information that has a public function, that is oriented towards the public good. Because let's not forget, the whole conference is dedicated to the idea of supporting the spread of information as a public good. Things that go viral are not by themselves bad, So for instance, it would be fantastic if it was good, for instance, that the information on how to protect yourself against COVID went viral during COVID. It is great, for instance, imagine that in the minutes before the horrible earthquake in Turkey and Syria, information how to protect yourself against the earthquake had gone viral in a sense. So we should not, and that takes me to my last and final point. We should not criticize the concept of virality so much. We should rather try to use the power of online communication flows, the power of virality, and ask ourselves, what is the kind of content we want to go viral? And that is content which serves a public function, which serves the public good, content that that supports rather than hinders social cohesion, that enhances rather than violates human rights, that shows the beauty and breadth of the human experience rather than plays on our most basic and negative emotion. That's the kind of content we want to go viral. And in terms of how we get there, I've shown the 2 avenues which are open at the moment: regulation ex post after the fact, or a increased better input into the rules and algorithmic practices ex ante. Both of those play into each other, and both of them are necessary to answer the challenging task of regulating online speech environments. We haven't done, that's leading to my conclusion, we haven't done a very good job over the last 15 and 20 years to provide good rules for online speech. We're now at the cusp where new where new areas of speech emerge. Think of the metaverse. Think also of the potential of natural language models. ChatGPT will be mentioned during this conference a couple of times, I'm sure. And we're now at this cusp where we can correct some of the errors of the past and make sure that the way forward is more human rights based, more focused on social cohesion, and make sure that the private goals are not that not all online speech orders are optimized for private gains, but rather for the public good. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Now we move on to Sachin, who is online. Can we? Sorry, we didn't have much time to rehearse, to manage Zoom and going back and forth between the room and here and the Zoom. So apologies for the inconvenience. But it looks like we have Sachin here.
Hi, can you see and hear me?
We can both hear you and see you.
Perfect, perfect. Great. Thank you so much. I think I'll begin by just saying that the online public sphere is today not only a means of entertainment, but of livelihood for many. It's where we go to participate in democratic discourse. And I think given its centrality to our lives, it's particularly problematic that the public sphere is beset by things like conspiracy theories of varying degrees of outlandishness. And it often seems like the more outlandish the conspiracy, the more viral. I'll try to be louder. Let me know if it's still a problem. Okay, so I was saying that it often seems like the more outlandish the conspiracy, the more viral it becomes. Of course, in a negative sense, going back to the earlier speaker's comments about differentiating positive virality and negative virality. I'm talking more on the latter context. And I think that, again, focusing on the negative side, this phenomenon handicaps our ability to participate in the genuine exchange of ideas and views that should characterize public debate and discourse. So consequently, I think it's correct for policymakers, for activists and experts to call for regulatory action to deal with the problem of virality. I think the time is long gone when we can say in the spirit of John Perry Barlow that cyberspace has to be independent of public oversight and regulation. Incidentally, February 8 marked the 27th anniversary of Barlow's Declaration of Independence in cyberspace. But the question remains, what kind of regulation should we pursue? I want to redirect Barlow's ire and suggest that the regulatory model we adopt has to usher in a cyber world without corporate dominance. Our regulatory model must convey to our corporate masters, again borrowing Barlow's language, the following message: you have no sovereignty where we gather. There are several options on the table when it comes to regulating content moderation in general, and I think virality in particular. I think experts and scholars, including some of our panelists today, have suggested or perhaps will suggest the adoption of appeals mechanisms, multi-stakeholder councils, adoption of human rights standards, social media councils. But I think we need to move beyond these well-intentioned solutions if we are to tame the corporate behemoths that control the public square. These solutions fail to address, I think, the core problem plaguing content moderation today, which is content moderation at scale by dominant platforms. I think virality is occurring at the rate it is because dominant platforms host more content than it is possible to properly moderate, no matter how many moderators and automated systems they deploy. it doesn't matter what liability regime we impose on platforms, they will not be able to expunge the internet of harmful conspiracy theories about flat earthism or white supremacy. And I think if past experience is any guide, the imposition of greater responsibility on platforms will inevitably result in disproportionate censorship of minorities and the vulnerable, the very groups that are the most affected by virality. Moreover, such measures suffer from an added disadvantage. Imposing greater requirements on platforms will ensure that only the largest platforms survive and thrive. This entrenchment of monopoly power will make content moderation at scale, which I was referring to earlier, an even more acute problem. Uh, Furthermore, as experts such as Cory Doctorow have pointed out, monopolies have a way of subverting the law and engineering regulatory capture to ensure that the impact on their profits and power is minimal. When you can fit all the tech titans around a single boardroom table, collusion and cartelization is inevitable. Top tech company executives usually know each other, having worked together at some point in the handful of firms that dominate the market. Moreover, top regulators themselves are usually former executives of large tech firms who will possibly return to these firms once their government service is complete. Consequently, our solutions should be directed at ameliorating the problem of monopoly. If we can break the stranglehold of monopoly platforms, then we can begin to solve the problem of moderation at scale. And if we can do that, I think we can ensure that the content that platforms have to moderate is more manageable. Moreover, society won't be so impacted by the failures of platforms to contain harmful viral content because the reach of platforms won't be so extensive. There are other advantages of addressing the monopoly problem that have a direct bearing on the health of the information ecosystem that we have come to rely on for virtually all our needs. I think very often platforms permit harmful content to go viral because it serves the interests of powerful political factions or because of government pressure that can be formal or informal. Counterintuitively, the larger a platform, the more likely it is to succumb to such pressure. I think the Snowden saga furnishes an interesting example in this regard. The NSA revelations showed that virtually all the mega tech companies complied with the directive to spy on their users. But there were holdouts, smaller entities like LavaBit that chose to shut down rather than compromise the rights of their users. In other words, we need more Davids, not Goliaths. I think there are policy prescriptions we can follow to bring about such a Davidian world. I think for starters, we can make interoperability and data portability a reality. This solution has several advantages. It will reduce switching costs by making it easier for disenchanted users, of which there are many, to leave big platforms, but nonetheless stay in touch with their friends. It will also address the network effects problem currently bolstering the monopolistic status quo. People join big tech platforms because everyone else they know is on these platforms. But when these platforms lose users due to low switching costs, they become less valuable to join. Loss of existing users will, in other words, have a multiplier effect by also keeping potential users away. Moreover, this solution is democratic as it empowers users to vote with their feet and reject the gluttonous appetite of big platforms to host content at an unmanageable scale. As more people leave the entrenched platforms that are responsible for the virality problem, primarily responsible for the virality problem, And as fewer additional people join, the size of the largest monopolies, I believe, will go down. We will once again have, hopefully, a public sphere that is not hostage to the whims and fancies of a select few gatekeepers. Such a decentralized public sphere will, I think, promote greater access to accurate and reliable information. Of course, these are not the only tools in the toolbox. And like any policy prescription, they will not solve all our problems, but I believe they will put us on the right path. I'll stop there. I hope you could hear me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think I just jumped your introduction. I was just keen to make sure it's all working. My name is Helena Schwertheim. I'm joining from ISD Germany. I'm a senior digital policy and research manager there. It's a pleasure to join online. It would have been even more of a pleasure to join you in person, not only because Paris is such a beautiful city, but also to meet with all of these experts and to have these discussions. However, I'm sure we can have an excellent discussion anyway. I'm really intrigued to chat with the other panelists on this topic. So first of all, I wanted to just touch base with to maybe echo a little bit what the first speaker said, that of course, when we're speaking about virality here, we're actually talking about the artificial amplification of certain content generated by platforms' affordances, such as ranking algorithms. And then when we're saying, should this be regulated or not? Well, first of all, I think we're jumping the gun here a little bit. We're trying to understand, first of all, how algorithmic recommender systems are working and their kind of impacts as well. So really, when we're talking about regulation here, we're asking, should artificial amplification of content be regulated? And similar to the first panelist as well, I think here we're jumping into a kind of argument that has been packaged in the past as the freedom of speech versus the freedom of reach argument. So first of all, you may be able to say something on the platform that might be harmful but legal. So it might be something insulting or harmful, but it isn't illegal. That is your freedom of speech. But the freedom of reach part comes that it doesn't actually mean that you have the right for this harmful but legal content to be amplified across a platform or to reach more people than it organically ever would. And often these two are juxtaposed against each other. But I would actually say this is a false argument because it ignores the fact that in many jurisdictions, the freedom of speech is already limited to some extent. For example, if it's illegal hate speech, on a certain topic, or certain audiences may not receive certain topics. I'm speaking about age, for example, or also it may be limited because of the setting that one is in. Often it's also said that in some jurisdictions, you're not allowed to yell fire if that is not the case in a cinema, for example. So these are all restrictions that can only be put in on freedom of expression in cases of legality, legitimacy, necessity, and proportionality. And I argue we're not quite there in understanding fully the impact of some of these algorithmic recommender systems on these points. And second, if you're looking again at the freedom of speech versus freedom of reach argument, there's an inherent assumption here that's already been highlighted. It's this assumption that the current system is neutral. And this is simply not the case. Platforms are not neutral. They've been built by certain engineers. They are owned by certain people. All of these individuals have their own bias, and more importantly, they have the aims of a business model or business goals at the end of the day as well. So there is no way that you could actually call this public sphere as a neutral platform or neutral sphere in this sense. Content and behavior is already being distorted with these impacts. So really, ranking algorithmic recommender systems, they are the systems that control how and what we see on platforms. And as someone's already illustrated, there's actually a need for this. There's a plethora of content on the internet. Without this, we wouldn't be able to make sense of any of the content available. Often to mind springs kind of the comparison to the Library of Babel, where there's so much information you can't make sense of it, it all becomes Babel. So I'd like to then ask, okay, so how does artificial amplification or recommendation occur? And how may it distort online discourse in a negative sense? How may it erode the quality of information, and how could it potentially create online risks? I'd like to also just add here that in this point, I'm making the assumption that illegal content is not allowed on a platform, as per the UNESCO guidance and as most regulations, also as in most terms and conditions of most services. I'm not making, I know that this is not often the case, but in this thought process, I am taking that point in. So the problem once you ignore the amplification of illegal content, if you're just looking at the amplification via algorithms of borderline content, so the stuff that is harmful but legal content, we're speaking about mis and disinformation, about conspiracy theories, about inflammatory or insulting speech that itself is not illegal yet, then, as I said, it's useful to have these recommended systems to help you manage your way through all of this content. But at the same time, algorithmic recommender systems, they can distort this public discourse if we compare it to, there is no neutrality, but often people would compare it to when content is being just put up in the chronological order in which it is being created. So I wanted to give one example of a very obvious negative impact on online ecosystems when algorithmic ranking systems are used, specifically talking about engagement ranking systems. So one of the issues that we see on online platforms, and you can think of your average Facebook or Twitter, is you have the natural engagement bias pattern, which in simple words, you see that users tend to engage. By engage, I mean liking, sharing, or commenting on content that nears the cutoff point, which is allowed on a platform. So engagement-based ranking tends to prioritize content which is near this borderline of what is illegal or what is allowed. So content to be that is likely to be much more harmful because it is near that cutoff line. So the outcome is that on a platform, the content that is recommended most by these engagement recommender systems is the content that is more sensationalist, that is more scandalous, that is more close to illegal content, and is being favored by the systems. And it simply increases the chances of you being recommended that is on this borderline. So this is just one way in which we know that algorithmic recommender systems may encourage more borderline content to spread online. And I would say that just this example already illustrates the potential damage of the right to reliable information for users or of quality information available. Also, I would say, even borderline content, we call it borderline. Some people also refer to it as legal but harmful. There are inherent risks that come with this, and they can really threaten democracy in the long run, but also violate human rights. What I would also say is that this example comes directly out of a business model. You're trying to maximize the engagement on the platform. You're trying to maximize for the amount of eyeballs on this platform. And again, this just illustrates that platforms are not neutral. Without regulation, they are not neutral with regulation. There is no neutrality here that can be distorted. Finally, what I want to say about this example is that the only reason that we know about it is because it's come from the reports and research from platforms themselves. So the natural engagement bias pattern has been spoken about by Meta, formerly Facebook, and this is how we know so explicitly about this. And this brings me to my next point, is that actually there is this massive knowledge gap and a lack of clear evidence when it comes to the effects of algorithmic ranking. So just consider that the employees at platforms that are responsible for building and testing these ranking algorithms, they're not incentivized to uncover the potential risks of these ranking systems, of societal divisions or the biases inherent in them. So ranking algorithms and the actual effects are not entirely understood by external researchers and organizations, and by extension, by policymakers and the public as well. So researchers, policymakers, and regulators, as these, we currently don't understand the aggregate effects of algorithmic ranking, or therefore how virality may work. We have some pretty good indications. We have many good case studies and examples illustrating the potential harms and risks of ranking systems. I'm happy to go into that later as well. Don't have the time here, but this this information asymmetry is largely due to the lack of platform data access. And I would say that seen black and white on a purely legal level, it would be impossible to speak with certainty about the legality, legitimacy, necessity, or proportionality of regulating or limiting these algorithms. And I say this because any policy intervention should be based on evidence, especially if it is to limit the freedom of speech. And this is something then that I want to come to when I was looking at the UNESCO guidelines. I see that there is actually a key to this, as we also see in some draft or actual regulation around the world as well. And that is calling for audits of recommender systems or automated processes. And this is because audits are an essential feature for public policy interventions that seek an evidence base and compliance with due diligence obligations. I'm not going to quote directly the guidance, but it is something along the lines of digital platforms commissioning regular external audits of machine learning tools for automated curation and recommender mechanisms. And you can see already there, I think this is one of the points that will really need to be worked on in the future. There are different terminologies being used there. Some of the terminology I was using previously was language that we see a lot in the European Union's Digital Services Act. So I think this is already one challenge that I think we should concentrate as researchers, as academics, as civil society, but also as regulators and governments and platforms in this field, is there needs to be an understanding of clear definitions and terminology as we try to come together about trying to understand algorithmic ranking systems themselves. So as I'm indicating, there are also other regulations already out there or in the process, which also call for algorithmic audits. So as I mentioned, the Digital Services Act in the EU, but also in the UK, you have the Online Safety Bill, which seems to also be calling for similar processes as well. And I would also just say that this is in line with this general call, which is quite unprecedented for transparency and reporting algorithms, reporting obligations in the EU and the UK, but specifically also this UNESCO regulation as well. And like I've said, this is a really new field. Even in the EU, where this legislation has now passed, we're seeing very large online platforms scrambling with how to actually conduct these audits. Likewise, there will be a requirement for third-party researchers to conduct such audits. So civil society, academia, as well as industry. And they are also testing a variety of methodologies that could be used to measure different potential risks. And here again, I come to the point that there is actually no standardization. There are several types of methodologies that can be deployed in trying to understand the impact of algorithmic ranking systems, so different ways of doing audits, but there is still no standardization among industry across platforms on how to go about this in a clear way. And I think this is really something that I would like to discuss a little bit further. I think attention just in general needs to be brought to, because we're starting to see a fragmentation of how audits are being conducted. And lastly, and I will finish on this, is maybe also to say, as I'm sitting here in Europe, I'm watching, like I said, big platforms scramble to understand how this will be done, as well as the industry itself, which will also be conducting audits. And there's kind of a question of the massive capacity, both on a human resources side, but also on a financial resources side, on how to actually enact this. And I think this shouldn't go unnoticed if guidelines such as from UNESCO to be implemented across the globe. I think this is another point that I just wanted to raise about the need for funding for this as well. Thank you very much. Looking forward to other people's comments as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elena. Move on to Shashank.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It has been really good to hear my co-panelists who've gone before me. Sorry, am I audible? Great. Yes, I was just saying it's been great to hear my co-panelists who've gone before me. They've already made some great points that I wanted to cover, and I second them on some of the critical points that they have made. I would like to quickly thank UNESCO for this opportunity and really appreciate to be part of this important conversation. Just adding to my co-panelists, and I'll try and keep my comments from the perspective of India as a lens to the global South experience. So, I'm just setting the context for some of my comments. I think I want to start by saying that digital platforms have led to a number of positives as well. I think, especially in India, where it has led to democratization of information flows, participation in electoral democracy, giving a voice to certain marginalized communities that didn't have a voice before to highlight their concerns, and sort of distribution of information at large that we've not seen before. Of course, as we highlight some of the challenges that all of us are well aware of, and we've spoken in this panel as well, I just wanted to set the context that there are some positives that come with having digital platforms. And also, when we sort of think about regulation, it'd be good to keep those positives in mind. Of course, moving on to some of the challenges that we are well aware of that emanate from especially virality and viral information on these platforms. And if I sort of draw a lens on India, we've seen a lot of amplification of hate speech that have caused a lot of harm. We regularly see mis and disinformation being sort of circulated on digital platforms, violent content against women, children, and also different members on the gender spectrum, the LGBTQ plus A plus community, and just highlighting some of the harms also that occur on digital platforms, right? And as we envision how to sort of mitigate against these harms. As the guidance document that UNESCO has sort of put up says that I will not be commenting on specific harms here, and we'll try to sort of discuss the design challenges of digital platforms that basically enable these harms and viral information. Just moving on from that, I think I'd like to commend UNESCO for putting on these guidelines. They're a very useful step towards thinking about digital platforms and regulation. Currently in India, the government's been actively thinking about renewing the existing internet regulation and platform regulation laws. So it's a very timely and useful document for definitely us, and I'm sure other countries in the global South as well. I think the guidelines start with something which is very important, and I'd like to highlight that, which is state duties. I'd like to set the context that, unfortunately, if I speak about India's reality, there's much scope for improvement on that front. In our experience, as the government sort of bringing about regulation for the internet, there's sort of, we see a pattern where from, let's say, corporate control that we've been talking about, we see the needle move towards more government control of information flow. And that's been a challenge. And I know that the UNESCO guidelines document often speaks about freedom of expression and freedom of information. And some of the regulation that the Indian government has been bringing is sort of has the unintended consequence of impinging on some of these rights. Just setting the context and quickly moving on to the question of virality. I think I agree with my co-panelists that virality in itself is not necessarily harmful. And I think before me, Helena, and even my colleague Sachin made this point, that often the edge cases of content that are sort of lying between harmful, lawful, or not is what becomes viral, and that's the pertinent question to sort of consider. Because that kind of content is what brings eyeballs, and then we start talking about the incentives that platforms have. Unfortunately, these big platforms are designed for making content viral, and hence we definitely need to look at the design of these platforms. I'm not going to go into the question of incentives for platforms. I think that's a question of antitrust law and some sort of macro regulation. But considering we're sort of building perspective on the guidelines that UNESCO has already put out, I want to comment on two specific fronts. One is on curation of content, and the other is on moderation of content. I have certain recommendations that basically, in certain circumstances, build on existing guidelines that the UNESCO has drafted, and sort of re-emphasize some of those. I'll start with certain recommendations that can be possibly immediately made without impinging on freedom of speech. That's one of the questions for this panel. And I'll start with certain recommendations on curations. I think currently, and I think this is done because because of the DSA coming into force, a lot of platforms, for example, Instagram has started offering the option for users to opt for chronological feeds, in addition to sort of curated content. I think one specific measure that the guidelines could build on is to lay down a guideline that says that a chronological field should be the default mechanism for someone to look at a digital platform. What this does is it sort of reins in some of the mechanisms on how content is viral. And talking about the sort of black box or sort of these algorithms that determine this information to be viral, it kind of reins that question. Right. So I'm coming back to my recommendations. My first recommendation was if we can sort of make the chronological feeds on these digital platforms as default. Second is, and I think again, part of the guidance already points to this, is certain content that has already become viral should come with certain visible and specific tags. For example, we know that Twitter has used misinformation tags before. Other platforms have used sort of harmful content tags, for example, Instagram. I think a certain use of certain tags when content becomes viral for informing users might be a very important and relevant guideline that we can lay down. Something that we often suffer in India, for example, is content curation not taking into account language and cultural nuance. I think platforms have a long way to go. I've sort of read documents that say that significant resources of digital platforms are spent on moderation on non-dominant market countries, for example, the US. India being one of the largest markets for almost all platforms, not enough resources are spent on looking at content curation and content moderation. I think when we talk about algorithmic transparency, I think this question has been around for a very long time. But one specific measure that we can adopt is possibly make platforms tell us how algorithms work. Of course, that's part of the guidelines and also the DSA. But what metrics are used by these algorithms to determine the virality? For example, is it based on the number of likes? Is it based on the number of reshares? If we as scholars and academics start getting this information, and I'm sort of doubling down on Helena's point, when we get access to this information, only then we can sort of think about specific measures. I'm quickly going on to certain recommendations on content moderation. I think consistent applications of terms and conditions across and between users is something that the guidelines already considers. I think it's very important. Regulation also should make platforms demonstrate how they comply with this. Platforms should also have policies, again, that are specific to countries. If I take India as an example, it's an extremely heterogeneous society. We have very unique challenges in our community based on gender rights, based on class, based on caste. That's not something that the Western world has, but it's very unique to India. I think, again, platforms need to invest a lot of money and demonstrate how they are able to understand cultural and regional nuance, and modulate their content moderation and curation accordingly. I think three very quick last points are that platforms need to clearly and uniformly lay down and communicate when they take down content. I think this is, again, a very useful and a part of the guideline document that the UNESCO has drafted. When it comes to takedowns and account suspensions, I think platforms need to be more specific. They need to give reasons when accounts are suspended or content is taken down. And especially when this content is taken down at the behest of the state. A couple of last pointers is that platforms should not be held liable for voluntary mechanisms of content moderation. I think we're seeing this happening in the US. There's currently a case being argued before the Supreme Court of the US where the question is that content curation and moderation impinges on their Section 230 sort of protection. I think this will significantly impact freedom of information and freedom of expression online. Guidelines should not hold platforms accountable for voluntary mechanisms of content moderation. My last point is platforms should always have the discretion to respond to user notices that flag illegal or harmful content and decide for themselves in that particular case whether that content should be taken down or not. If we start holding platforms accountable and don't give them the discretion to respond to user notices, I feel that will significantly, again, impact freedom of speech and information. I think I've utilized my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, before we move on to the questions, and please prepare your questions. We have now Ellen Judson from DMOS for the last talk on this roundtable. Ellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and really lovely to be here with you all. As Helena said, wish I could be there in person. How is the sound doing? Am I coming through on all the channels all right? So really wanted to echo a lot of what the other panelists have said around virality obviously not being harmful in and of itself, but us all being very familiar with the kinds of harms that we tend to see in information environments from viral information, whether that's disinformation campaigns, hate campaigns, or campaigns of abuse online, but also this sort of general phenomenon of information chaos, just people being bombarded with too much information that they don't understand where it's come from or what it means, according to these kind of mysterious rules, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, the rules of the platforms, which we don't have access to or a really kind of deep understanding of how it's operating. So I think this question about can we regulate for virality, the motivation really comes from, again, not virality itself being harmful, but the fact that if we think about a lot of these harms in terms of content, we get into difficult territory around freedom of expression very quickly, where a lot of this content is legal, a lot of this content is of a kind that we think should remain legal, and so then tackling kind of the amplification and the dissemination of the content feels like a sort of way through how to tackle that tension between, we can see there's harms arising from certain kinds of content, but also not wanting to restrict or ban that content outright. And I wanted to go back to what Helena was discussing about this argument around freedom of speech and freedom of reach, because this is something we hear quite a lot in the conversations around this. And I think I completely agree that platforms are not a kind of neutral space. So it's not that any tweaks or changes to how content is curated are inherently sort of violating freedom of expression if they make certain kinds of content more or less viral. But I think there is a sort of worry around how we know that platforms' content curation systems tend to work of, for instance, often the speech of marginalized groups might be more commonly misidentified as harmful content. So I say that because I think there's a worry around, if we simply say, okay, what platforms need to do is to change their content curation algorithm to de-rank anything that they think is probably harmful, we might have kind of knock-on effects on freedom of expression legitimate content that might kind of disproportionately impact certain groups. So while I agree there's no kind of absolute right to freedom of reach, I think there is something around whose reach is impacted and what's the reason that somebody's reach might be impacted by these content curation decisions. So I think the question that regulation and regulators really need to have the power to understand and get platforms to answer is, what are the principles of content curation being used, and what are the impacts of implementing those principles? And I think it's really important to stress there's not going to be kind of one way to do this, that there's going to be one content curation algorithm that's going to be the best one, and we just have to make all the platforms use that. Different platforms will have very different purposes, they serve different communities, they serve different interests and roles in people's lives, but it is really important that users are able to understand that and understand how content may be being curated or amplified or moderated in these different spaces. And so I think that the point that the others have made as well about transparency being a kind of key outcome of regulation is really important. I also wanted to talk a little bit about a few other things that regulation can look at beyond just ranking algorithms and content curation. And I think there was a question in the chat actually mentioning WhatsApp and virality on WhatsApp and how that occurs. And I think one really big question is around what should platforms be doing, as well as content curation changes, to reduce some of the harms associated with harmful content going viral. And so a really big one around this is how are platforms designing their services and functionalities to increase or decrease friction. And we've seen, the major platforms introducing various things to try and kind of introduce some of that friction. So it might be a sort of behavioral nudges. If you try and share an article on Twitter and the little pop-ups comes up saying, do you want to read that article before you share it? Or something which, scans your content and says, this may be offensive to some people. Are you sure you wish to post this? Or even things like in WhatsApp to take the audience's comment point, elements like labeling when something has been forwarded or limiting the number of people that you can forward something to at any one time. All of these things, again, they're not kind of preventing the sharing of content or preventing the amplifying of content, but they're just putting in those extra few steps to make it more difficult particularly for those systems to be weaponized by bad actors who may be trying to spread disinformation through these platform systems. So I think that's another kind of important thing that regulation can oversee and require kind of accountability from platforms on, is what design choices about the functionalities that they have they made, and what impact is that having on how content is disseminated, and the kind of human rights impacts associated with that. I think, again, to Helena's point about there's a lot we don't know in this space, in terms of what, thinking if we were designing a kind of content curation system to most support the idea of information as a public good, what would that look like? What would be in the code? I think is one of those things that is not going to be sort of solved overnight. And I think the need for regulation to be really kind of iterative and responsive to testing and experimentation, and sharing some of that knowledge that we know platforms are doing this sort of testing on. If they change their algorithm in a certain way, what impact does it have on engagement? What impact does it have on certain kinds of content? So is there a way that regulation can really bring that knowledge and that data and that understanding into the public domain, so that we can have more of a sense of where we're trying to get to in our kind of ideal vision of what a sort of public space and content curation look like. In terms of the UNESCO guidance in particular, I think there's a lot that is really positive, and particularly looking at risk assessments and taking a very sort of more upstream systems approach rather than thinking about individual pieces of content. I think it's the right approach, particularly when we're thinking around content curation, very much as a system rather than a outcome of specific instances of content. I think the thing I would encourage more focus on there would be trying to move the focus even more upstream. And I think there's often, when we talk about systems and processes of what platforms what we're overseeing from platforms, there's very much a focus on the content moderation and the content curation systems and processes. But there's so much that happens before content is being curated on a platform or moderated on a platform in terms of, as I said, the platform design, the service design, how the internal kind of operation and setup of the company kind of facilitates those decisions being made, and what the effects of how those systems have been built, how they've been developed, how they can be reviewed. So I think one thing is looking at risk assessments at all stages of the systems and processes that platforms have in place, and not only on that kind of end stage content curation and content moderation side. I think there's also an element around privacy, and there's something we've talked a little bit about in terms of how content is targeted, or how content may be shared and disseminated based on users' particular profiles. But I think the role that personal data and the use of personal data plays in personalized content curation is a kind of particular threat to that idea of the sort of public information sphere, where we have these very hyper-personalized content curation. This is the kind of the famous, TikTok is the famous example of this, of being able to, within a few videos, direct users down these very narrow streams of content where you really don't have any visibility over what's happening in the rest of the online space, but which, the operation of it and how it uses personal data and data about their interaction with the platform is still very kind of opaque and not particularly transparent. And I think coupled with that, there is a risk, and I say this, particularly from the UK perspective, where we've done a lot of work on the UK proposals around online regulation, around kind of a focus on content and safety outcomes, often forgets about privacy and sees privacy as sort of barrier to be doing better content moderation or better content curation. And so I think another thing for the UNESCO guidelines that I would like to see would be a greater kind of explicit focus on the need to protect privacy and ensure that kind of functionalities of platforms are being assessed on the basis of how well they protect privacy, as well as how well they lead to particular kind of content curation outcomes. So I'll leave it there, but looking forward to hearing questions and comments from my other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe before we take questions from the audience, maybe some of you want to jump on what has been said, to react to what each of you said.
Sure. Is it possible to go ahead? Hello.
Go ahead.
Great. No, I just had a limited point on the challenge, as we sort of think and craft regulation, learning from the experience of the GDPR in the EU. And, I'm considering the EU a bit more mature in the context of having formal institutions and sort of robust policy making mechanisms as compared to India or some other global South countries. I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the success of these regulations that we consider is going to be dependent on enforcement. I'd sort of like to share some of experiences in even crafting regulation that we are having in India. For example, India recently released its latest version of its fourth version of data protection law, and it completely has done away with the prospective regulator. So that just points to the challenge of enforcement. Governments kept a sort of quasi-judicial body directly under its control in the proposed legislation. And we feel, and there's some sort of speculation, of course, that even in a future information technology law or internet regulation law that the government's currently working on, there may not be a regulator proposed. So I just want to sort of highlight that concern that it's really good to talk about and it's really important to talk about the nuance of regulation, but eventually it depends on its enforcement. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else would like to react to what the panelists said?
Yeah, maybe
Sure.
I'd just like to, oh, no, please, you go first.
Please, Helen, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to agree with what Shashank said. I think right now in the EU, we've seen the Digital Services Act being passed. I think the big question now is implementation and compliance with that. And that's something that regulators as well as civil society and academia have to watch. So I think that's my first point. I think, you know, GDPR gave us a lot of cookie banners. Is that really what we wanted? So I think that's the main question there. But also to a question that was posed in the chat about virality, where there are no algorithmic ranking systems, also thinking about other ways to minimize negative virality, or just to kind of stop that a little bit. I think there was a really good point made by Alan about introducing positive friction or nudges into that. And to say actually there are some interesting regulatory approaches to that as well. For example, in Australia, eSafety has come up with this safety by design framework, which actually encourages that as well. And it is a framework, it's a guideline, but I think that's quite a positive example of trying to ensure that that is something that is being worked towards by platforms as well. And that's included within a code of practice as well. And also there's been quite some interesting kind of like, you know, when you're talking about mitigating the negative effects of ranking systems, or also looking at other ways of incorporating this, there have been some really interesting proposals, which I don't think they come with their own kind of issues and stuff as well. But there's this concept, for example, of introducing middleware. So introducing middleware markets. And if you want, this is a proposal where there would be kind of a editorial layer. So it's a software between a dominant platform and users, where, for example, if I wanted to use a middleware that, for example, is very aware of climate change issues and such, I would be able to use something that is maybe being produced by a civil society and clip that into my my system, and then I would not see any disinformation against climate change, for example, so, or on different issues. So this is a technological alternative that has been introduced and kind of discussed elsewhere. It doesn't come without its own problems, but I also just wanted to share, you know, I think there is some more examples out there to think about alternatives to just regulating this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias.
And I just wanted to add that we have to be very mindful of the different developments happening concurrently in different jurisdictions. Here, especially, I'm thinking of the current cases at the US Supreme Court, which have the potential to influence how platforms deal with algorithmic choices, with recommender systems. And we shouldn't forget that while there is, of course, no global application of Supreme Court judgment, there's still a certain impact, because a lot of the major platforms have certain ties to the U.S. jurisdiction. So let's keep that in mind, especially as we move forward with a view to the to a global solution for dealing with virality.
Serena, I think you had a question from the audience online.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I have one short, simple, but very difficult question from the audience. So it's platforms business model can survive without viral content? I don't know if it's...
I think the question is whether we can harness virality without challenging and jeopardizing the business model of platforms. Is that the question?
Of course. Yes, this is the question.
Let me just add a comment here. I mean, there's no immunity for any one kind of business model. Just because we haven't done anything meaningful over the last 15 years doesn't mean that platforms have a God-given eternal rights to extract value from data. I think that any challenge to the current business model is something that we should, as individuals, as scholars, as civil society people, as diplomats, should actually applaud, because it might introduce a new it might introduce innovation and challenge and competitiveness to the way that that value is being extracted from platforms. And we see that with Twitter, for instance, how difficult it is for even somebody who's moderately clever and can get people to the Mars in the next couple of years, how difficult it is to extract value in a way that makes sustainable. So developing business models that are both sustainable and provide added value to society is hugely difficult, but also we shouldn't always take the easy way out, just saying, here's the data, use your algorithm however you want to. But yes, there's challenges that difficult.
Okay, I think other speakers online would like to add up to this answer.
Yes, I'll add something quickly. Just agree that I think challenging the business model is part of what we need to do in order to be kind of tackling the harms that we know are occurring. And I think that is also, just to add in terms of sort of specifically thinking about the UNESCO guidance we're discussing, there are a lot of references to ways that systems which are designed to enhance, increase user engagement should be risk assessed. And while I totally agree they should, I think that sort of slightly presupposes that systems should all be designed to maximize user engagement. And that's the only way that platforms should and can be designed. And I think being able to have that conversation about what else could platforms be maximizing for, how could we have a diversity of spaces, engagement is always going to be part of it, but how could we bring in other goals and other things that we want to be maximizing for in these public spaces, I think is really important.
Thank you. Would anyone else or can we take another question?
I'd like to, Sachin, you want to go?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Shashank. I'll go after you. Yeah, end up first.
No, very quickly, I think we're being very optimistic in thinking that we can really curtail viral content by some of these suggestions that we've made. I think platforms are very well placed and very high above in the sort of information chain, if I would say, and hold significant power in the information asymmetry that we were talking about, for us to really believe that virality will go down quite quickly. Also, answering the question on more of its merit, I think it's useful to understand what status quo we have when we think about regulation of digital platforms. I think revenues of platforms are well cemented currently and are ever growing. So we may be wanting to visit the question of market risk probably in a few years if we end up achieving what we seek to with these guidelines. So just wanted to keep it that. Sachin, please go ahead.
Are there questions in the audience, in the room? Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly answer. Sorry.
Okay. Go ahead, and then we take it.
Yeah. No. Just to say that I think short answer is that it's very difficult for platforms to for the current business models of platforms to be sustainable without a certain degree of exploitation of data, of content in the interest of virality. I think that's a short answer. I think again, in terms of just going back to something that Matthias said about current legal developments, contemporary legal developments, one issue that's also kind of playing out in the US courts is the challenge to Facebook/Meta's acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp. And there also is the question of, what is the business model of platforms? And I think one answer that people have suggested and that we can kind of, think about is the business model is to a large degree a business model of acquisition, right? Of a lot of competitors, potential competitors, existing competitors, nascent competitors, so as to increase the size of the platform, so as to increase the potential impact of virality. So in a sense, kind of to conclude, virality seems to be central to the business model. And so I think all the more reason that it'll be difficult to kind of uncouple or untangle that.
Thank you. So I think it's really helpful that UNESCO is taking on more of a systems approach for content moderation, that second wave scholarship in law that's useful. But it also presents challenges because we don't know how to map the system, right? What are the limits of this? And so we had talked about auditing, and I do auditing for human rights impact assessments. And the key thing is, of course, making data available for researchers. And the guidelines have that provision, but they also give an out to platforms by having a clause about trade secrets. And so platforms are able to invoke trade secrets to deny access to researchers to conduct audits. It's going to undermine a lot of the spirit of the guidance. So I'm curious from either Matthias or Helena, how do we think about creating meaningful public-centered audits that are not just done by, people that are selected by the company themselves, and to ensure that those auditors can get access to information and not sort of hide behind trade secrets and other forms. Thank you.
Want to answer that?
Happy to start. That's an excellent question, and scholars, NGOs have been pushing during the process of the development of the Digital Services Act not to allow sort of a self-certification through self-chosen auditing companies. It is highly likely that using McKinsey or others won't lead to the same result as using an external NGO or a human rights firm. So I believe that two elements are important here. First of all, civil society and outside academics will need to ensure that those audits are as meaningful as possible, including by providing shadow reports or shadow audits. Secondly, since there are tools to enable access to raw data, we need to continue to provide to do our own analysis to make sure that there's no whitewashing or greenwashing or ethics washing, and thirdly, we need to make sure that the digital services coordinators on the local and the national level and on the level of the commission, that they take their job seriously and audit the audits themselves and make sure that those are up to a standard necessary to actually introduce meaningful change. But we should take those problems and translate them for the next 2 days. So we should really talk about how we can do a better job on a global level within the UNESCO document.
Yes, I agree with all of those points, and maybe also to add to it, I'm not sure, I can't see unfortunately who raised that question, but you mentioned that you yourself conduct human rights impact assessments, and I think that's actually a very interesting case, and I think has been integral in understanding how these things work and the possibilities in itself, and has, if you want, been a bit of a blueprint to thinking of how risk assessments or audits as well can be undertaken. And I think a massive point here as well is that third-party audits, they also need to be made public. So I know that for a human rights impact assessment, it took a lot of civil society pressure for Facebook to actually publish a summary of that. So it's one thing doing these audits, it's also another point of them actually being public as well. And I mean, for third-party researchers, civil society and academics and such, as I was kind of mentioning, there is this plethora of methodologies that can be used, and each of them have got the ups and downs with just the access to data that we currently have, which is incredibly limited. You have code audits, you have user surveys, you can use scraping, APIs, sock puppets, crowdsourced data. I'm sure you're familiar with this as well, but it's incredibly limited, and we always come back to this information asymmetry. I think something I personally get really excited about under the Digital Services Act is that it promises to provide unprecedented levels of data access to third-party researchers for the assessment of systematic risks when it's in compliance with the DSA as well. So when this is rolled out, European researchers will have unprecedented data access. And I think this is something that the world will be watching how it works. We now have this draft code of conduct from EDMO on how that can be done in compliance with the GDPR article, I want to say 40, on how to ensure that is still being done. And I think this is ideally something that can be built on as well. And I'd be really keen to see also what the limitations of that is. If one is trying to assess, for example, a civil society organization outside of Europe, would they still be able to access some of the data if they want to do research on risks in the EU? So there are all of these questions as well, but by answering those, you start to see some of the potential as well as we can go forth as well. Thanks.
Okay, maybe a last question, because time is running and I guess many of you are starting to starve. So go ahead.
Very brief, I want to refer to Matthias' proposal to implement something like platform parliaments, which maybe could decide about principles of content moderation. So I think it's connect to a very general point, which we discussed in the last session, the combination about governance by state, by legal regulations, how to combine it with self-governance principles. And this would be one example for doing this. And then if you look at the power of virality, what was it called? Well, then we can see if we look for technological solutions for making self-governance possible, then we can use many aspects of the digital instruments, like they have possibilities of low costs interventions. We can have social information on very low cost level. So I think the internet world, the digital world, has many options for us to make this self-governance principles possible inside this world. And I think this is a very important combination, because alone, a colleague said it, alone content moderation from outside is not possible alone. So we need this internal mechanisms to introduce them, and not only by legal interventions, but by making possible civil society interventions by for example, making social norms workable inside the digital world. So I think it's an important example for what we should do in general.
Any reaction to this before we close for this morning?
There will be another session at 5 o'clock on that topic, so on platform council.
It is strictly forbidden to make any announcement for anything else than this specific symposium. You will be fined $2 million. I'm sorry, that was the rule. You knew it.
Désolé, il faut rester ici absolument.
It's good. I mean, we are happy to have $2 million. You know, we didn't expect that much today. Okay, well, thank you so much to everyone for these two great panels. And we have two more this afternoon, in addition with a keynote from Nena and Kanwa.